Long before the age of modern medicine, humanity lived under a veil of invisible threats. Among the most feared of these was smallpox, a disease that struck without warning, leaving devastation, scars, and death in its wake. Entire villages, towns, and even great cities could be rendered ghostly in weeks, their streets empty, markets abandoned, and homes left to crumble. Survival in this harsh reality was never guaranteed. It demanded careful observation, ingenuity, courage, and a relentless will to endure. In ancient Egypt, the earliest records hint at families observing the first signs of infection with meticulous attention. Pustules would appear on the skin, often accompanied by fever, fatigue, and delirium. Those who survived these initial symptoms became living lessons for others. Mothers taught daughters how to care for the sick, how to maintain distance, and how to avoid contaminated objects. Elders recorded observations in oral histories, passing down knowledge about which methods of care seemed to alleviate suffering, which herbs might reduce fever, and which isolation practices prevented spread. Knowledge itself became a tool for survival. India too faced waves of smallpox known in Sanskrit texts as Masurika. Villages developed early forms of inoculation, observing that survivors of mild cases often remained immune to subsequent outbreaks. Communities experimented with transferring small amounts of material from mild cases into healthy individuals, a risky but sometimes life-saving practice. Observation was critical. Families learned which individuals were more susceptible, how the disease moved through households, and which natural remedies provided even partial relief. Empirical learning, intertwined with spiritual practice, shaped early survival strategies. China's ancient dynasties approached smallpox with both ritual and observation. Families noted that particular wind patterns or crowded market areas seemed to correlate with infection. Temples often became centers of care, where monks and healers administered herbal concoctions and supervised isolation practices. Observation guided action. People learned to separate the sick from the healthy, ventilate homes, and manage resources carefully. Even small insights, such as which herbs relieved fever or which isolation methods slowed spread, could determine life or death. Food and water were inseparable from survival. Disease weakened the body, making nutrition critical. Communities foraged for edible roots, tubers, and wild greens, while ensuring that stored grains and preserved foods were safe. Herbs were tested for medicinal properties. Some soothed fever, others disinfected wounds, while a few were believed to strengthen immunity. Observation and experimentation informed every choice: which plants were safe, how to prepare them, and which storage methods prevented spoilage. Nutrition, awareness, and adaptability were constantly interlinked. Quarantine, though often rudimentary, became a critical tool. Villages and towns instinctively isolated infected households or entire districts, observing that separation reduced transmission. Families learned to identify early symptoms and react quickly, sometimes abandoning homes entirely if they became contaminated. Social observation was key: who to trust, how to provide care safely, and how to maintain essential cooperation without risking further spread. Communities refined isolation methods over generations, embedding survival strategies into their cultural memory. Psychological resilience emerged as a crucial survival skill. The appearance of pustules, high fever, and the smell of sickness created fear, not just in the infected but in entire communities. Children learned to navigate fear through structured routines, storytelling, and small responsibilities. Adults practiced rituals, prayers, and communal support systems to maintain focus and calm. Mental fortitude became inseparable from physical survival. A vigilant, composed mind allowed better observation, careful care, and more effective allocation of resources. Care for the sick relied on both observation and inherited knowledge. Families created protective measures. Long sticks were used to deliver food, beds were elevated or separated, and cloth barriers shielded caregivers. Herbal remedies were applied with careful attention to symptom progression. Observation was constant. Did fever reduce after a poultice? Did isolation slow spread? Notes were taken mentally or recorded when possible, creating an early body of empirical knowledge. The act of caring itself became a sophisticated system, balancing risk, empathy, and effectiveness. Children were both vulnerable and essential carriers of survival knowledge. Families taught them to recognize edible plants, collect clean water, and avoid contaminated areas. Even play became educational, mimicking isolation techniques. Learning observation skills and helping with safe food preparation were integrated into daily life. Each lesson reinforced survival strategies and ensured that practical knowledge persisted through generations. The continuity of life depended on careful instruction, observation, and ethical responsibility. Community cooperation remained a central pillar of survival. Families pooled resources, shared medicinal herbs, coordinated care, and maintained vigilance. Observation of human behavior guided alliances. Those who demonstrated caution, reliability, and prudence became trusted partners. Ethical behavior, sharing food, providing care, and adhering to quarantine rules was not simply moral, it was a survival imperative. Cooperation amplified resilience, allowing communities to endure epidemics that might have destroyed isolated households. Observation extended beyond the immediate household. People noted environmental and social patterns, which wines, streets, or public areas facilitated the spread of disease, which seasons were more dangerous, and which local remedies had the most effect. This knowledge informed decisions about travel, trade, and daily routines. Communities that meticulously tracked patterns of disease, weather, and social interaction were far better equipped to mitigate risk, demonstrating the intricate interplay of empirical observation, social intelligence, and cultural practice. Ultimately, survival during smallpox outbreaks demanded an integrated approach. Observation of the disease, careful management of food and water, strategic isolation, empirical application of herbal remedies, psychological resilience, and social intelligence all contributed to endurance. Survival was never random, it was the result of conscious adaptation, cumulative knowledge, and ethical action. Communities that mastered this combination not only preserved life, but ensured that wisdom would be passed to future generations, forming the foundation of humanity's enduring struggle against epidemic disease. The story of smallpox in ancient times is not simply one of death and despair. It is a story of observation, learning, courage, and adaptation. Each household, village, and city became a living laboratory of survival, testing and refining strategies that would echo through generations. Humanity's response to smallpox demonstrates that even in the face of invisible enemies, observation, ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience could carve a path through fear and devastation, preserving life and knowledge for the future. As smallpox spread across civilizations, its reach extended far beyond isolated villages, infiltrating entire regions and shaping the survival strategies of nations. In Egypt, India, China, and eventually Europe, the disease forced humans to confront not only the biological threat, but the societal upheaval it caused. Survival demanded more than isolated household strategies. It required communal coordination, observation of regional patterns, and the development of early preventive practices. In India, long before Western medicine understood immunity, communities began to practice a form of inoculation known as variolation. This involved deliberately exposing healthy individuals to material from mild smallpox cases, often through tiny scratches in the skin. Observation guided these risky interventions. Families noted who had mild reactions, who developed severe symptoms, and who emerged immune. The process required careful timing, monitoring, and an understanding of the patient's health. Those who succeeded became living proof of survival and resilience, their bodies carrying both immunity and the knowledge of what worked. China's approach combined herbal medicine with preventive isolation. Monks and healers meticulously documented the symptoms of smallpox, noting patterns in fever, pustule formation, and mortality rates. Communities observed the spread. They tracked which trade routes introduced infection, which wind patterns seemed to correlate with outbreaks, and which districts remained relatively safe. Temples often functioned as informal hospitals, providing care and enforcing isolation while offering spiritual guidance. Observation of human behavior, who complied with quarantine, who could be trusted to follow rules, became essential for effective survival. In Egypt, ancient records suggest that families and local leaders developed contingency plans for epidemics. Storage of grains, water management, and temporary relocation were practiced when outbreaks occurred. Observation was critical: which storage methods prevented spoilage, which neighborhoods remained free of disease, and which traditional remedies offered relief. Knowledge was passed orally, codified into family traditions, and integrated into rituals. Communities learned to balance practical survival with spiritual observance, ensuring morale remained intact even as fear dominated daily life. Trade routes became both lifelines and threats. Caravans carried food, herbs, and tools, but they also transported disease across vast distances. Observation of timing, routes, and cargo became critical. Merchants learned to avoid towns experiencing outbreaks, delay travel during high-risk seasons, and carry protective materials or herbal concoctions. Social intelligence played a vital role. Traders who ignored communal warnings often brought devastation back to their own settlements. Observation, strategy, and trust networks were as essential as physical endurance in the battle for survival. Nutrition and water remained pivotal. Epidemics weakened bodies, making them more susceptible to infection. Communities focused on rationing, preservation, and careful selection of foods. Observers noted which grains stored longest, which tubers provided vital nutrients, and which herbs boosted resistance or alleviated fever. Water sources were monitored daily for contamination. Wells, rivers, and collected rainwater were carefully managed. Small improvements in diet, hygiene, and water safety often made the difference between survival and death. Psychological endurance was continuously tested. Families confronted the death of neighbors, the collapse of social systems, and the ever-present fear of infection. Storytelling, songs, and ritualized care became essential tools for maintaining mental stability. Adults taught children resilience through chores, protective routines, and supervised observation. Communities structured daily life to create rhythm and predictability, countering the chaos that disease wrought. Mental focus and emotional regulation were inseparable from practical survival. Observational learning extended to symptom recognition and treatment. Healers and families meticulously noted how fever progressed, when pustules formed, and which remedies had effect. Even small reductions in discomfort or fever were carefully recorded and passed to others. Patterns of exposure, recovery, and mortality were monitored, creating an informal empirical database. These observations informed decisions about isolation, care, and early interventions, providing a lifeline for those at risk. Children were trained from birth in survival skills. They learned to collect safe water, identify edible and medicinal plants, and avoid contaminated areas. Play often doubled as education. Games simulated quarantine procedures or taught tracking and observation skills. Through this immersive training, survival knowledge became embedded in the next generation, ensuring that humanity's accumulated experience with smallpox was preserved and transmitted. Communal cooperation was central to endurance. Villages pooled resources, shared medicinal herbs, and coordinated care for the sick while observing strict quarantine measures. Observation of behavior determined trust networks. Families and neighbors who demonstrated diligence, ethical conduct, and reliability were included in resource sharing and caregiving arrangements. Ethical responsibility and social intelligence were critical tools, allowing communities to function cohesively even under extreme stress. Ultimately, survival during smallpox epidemics depended on a delicate balance: careful observation of disease patterns, strategic management of resources, empirical application of herbal remedies, psychological resilience, and cooperative social structures. Communities that mastered this integration survived more effectively and transmitted knowledge to future generations. These strategies, honed over centuries, formed the foundation for later medical discoveries, preventive practices, and the eventual development of vaccination. The global reach of smallpox illustrates that survival was not a local endeavor but a collective challenge. Each region adapted its strategies based on environment, culture, and observation, yet the underlying principles remained constant: vigilance, cooperation, adaptability, and transmission of knowledge. Humanity's response to smallpox demonstrates the power of observation, the value of cultural memory, and the necessity of ethical, coordinated action in the face of invisible, persistent threats. By the medieval period, smallpox had entrenched itself as a persistent threat across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Entire cities had to confront the disease not only as a biological hazard, but as a societal disruptor, reshaping labor, trade, governance, and daily life. Survival became a matter of both individual vigilance and collective strategy, requiring observation, adaptation, and strict adherence to emerging preventive practices. In Europe, the plague of smallpox intersected with other diseases and famines, compounding mortality and social instability. Observant communities noted patterns of infection, crowded homes and marketplaces accelerated spread, while isolated rural settlements often fared better. Families learned to reorganize daily routines, using early quarantine methods and separating sleeping areas to reduce transmission. Observation guided action: which households could safely share food, which routes allowed safe travel, and which medicinal plants could alleviate fever or discomfort. Monasteries and convents often became centers of care, combining empirical observation with spiritual guidance. Monks recorded symptoms, mortality rates, and responses to herbal remedies, creating informal epidemiological records. These institutions taught villagers how to isolate the sick, maintain clean water sources, and manage contaminated waste. Observation of human behavior was critical. Compliance with isolation and caregiving protocols determined whether outbreaks expanded or were contained. Communities relied heavily on ethical cooperation, as disregard for shared rules could devastate entire towns. Families adapted food practices to strengthen resistance. Nutritional awareness, though rudimentary, played a crucial role in survival. Observers noted that diets rich in grains, legumes, vegetables, and select herbs improved stamina during infection, while malnutrition exacerbated vulnerability. Preservation techniques, smoking, drying, and fermenting, ensured that families had access to safe food even during periods of disruption. Observation guided selection: which foods retained nutrients after storage, which herbs had fever-reducing properties, and which combinations provided balanced nutrition for the ill and healthy alike. Water hygiene became a matter of life and death. Contaminated wells and stagnant pools could exacerbate illness or spread secondary infections. Communities learned to monitor water sources carefully, avoiding suspicious areas, filtering water through cloth or sand, and sometimes boiling supplies when possible. Observation was constant. Changes in smell, clarity, or algae growth were signals to switch sources. Families taught these skills to children, ensuring the continuity of vital knowledge. psychological endurance remained critical. The fear of sudden infection, isolation, or the loss of loved ones created immense stress. Communities used ritual, prayer, and structured routines to maintain calm and cohesion. Children absorbed survival lessons through daily participation in caregiving, water collection, and observation exercises disguised as play. Mental focus enabled accurate observation, careful resource management, and strategic decision-making, illustrating that psychological resilience was inseparable from physical survival. Observation of symptom progression became more sophisticated. Caregivers tracked fever patterns, pustule development, and behavioral changes, noting which remedies, environments, or isolation practices produced observable improvements. This empirical approach, though limited, enabled survivors to maximize survival chances for themselves and others. Accurate observation became a lifeline. Those who documented and remembered what worked passed knowledge to subsequent generations, embedding practical wisdom in cultural memory. Children continued to play an essential role. By integrating chores, observation, and practical skills into daily routines, families ensured that survival strategies were internalized from a young age. Collecting clean water, identifying safe plants, assisting in caregiving, and learning. Isolation protocols became naturalized behaviors. Each child became a repository of knowledge, capable of acting both independently and cooperatively in times of crisis. The survival of knowledge was as critical as the survival of the body. Communal cooperation was constantly tested. Families pooled food, herbal remedies, and labor, often coordinating with neighbors to monitor health and enforce isolation rules. Observation of compliance and reliability guided trust networks. Those who neglected protocols were excluded, while diligent individuals were rewarded with inclusion in resource sharing and care systems. Ethical responsibility became a survival skill, ensuring that the most vulnerable were protected and that communities could function cohesively even under extreme pressure. By the end of this period, European communities had evolved sophisticated strategies for enduring smallpox. Observation, empirical testing, careful isolation, ethical cooperation, psychological resilience, and intergenerational knowledge transmission formed a multi-layered survival system. Families, monasteries, and villages had learned that survival depended on a combination of vigilance, creativity, and ethical engagement. These lessons were embedded in culture, forming a durable foundation that would influence future responses to epidemics. Smallpox in medieval Europe was not merely a biological phenomenon, it was a societal challenge that tested every facet of human resilience. Communities that observed carefully, adapted strategies, preserved knowledge, and cooperated ethically thrived, while those that failed to integrate these lessons suffered catastrophic losses. The experience demonstrated that survival was both an individual and collective achievement, requiring constant attention, ethical behavior, and the deliberate transmission of knowledge. Humanity's response to smallpox revealed that observation, cooperation, and resilience were not optional. They were essential instruments of life in an unpredictable and often hostile world. The story of smallpox took a devastating turn with the Age of Exploration. As European explorers, traders, and conquerors ventured across oceans to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they unknowingly carried the virus with them. For indigenous populations in the New World, smallpox was a catastrophic force, one they had never encountered and for which they had no immunity. Survival in this context was dramatically different from the long-established strategies of Europe and Asia, and it demanded extraordinary observation, adaptability, and resilience. In the Americas, smallpox spread like wildfire, moving through villages, cities, and entire regions in a matter of months. Observation became a desperate necessity. Indigenous healers noted the first signs: fever, fatigue, and the sudden appearance of pustules. Families quickly realized that close contact with infected individuals almost always led to illness. Communities that attempted to isolate the sick, while difficult under traditional social structures, sometimes slowed the spread of infection. Observation of behavior, who could safely assist, how to distribute food, and how to maintain the semblance of social order became central to survival. Resource management was a critical challenge. The virus often decimated large portions of communities, leaving survivors without labor to cultivate crops or gather water. Those who survived learned to prioritize essential tasks, securing potable water, foraging for edible plants, and preserving stored food. Observation of the natural environment guided action, identifying safe water sources, determining which plants were nutritious, and noting seasonal patterns that could influence disease progression or access to resources. Even small improvements in these strategies significantly increased survival odds. Herbal remedies were employed with careful attention to observation. Indigenous healers experimented with local plants, applying poultices to pustules, creating infusions to reduce fever, and administering decoctions believed to strengthen the body. Observation guided which treatments were retained. If a plant seemed to alleviate pain or prevent secondary infection, it became a critical tool for families. Knowledge was transmitted orally, often embedded in stories, songs, and ritual practices, ensuring continuity despite widespread mortality. Social organization shifted under the pressure of smallpox. Families and clans reorganized to protect the most vulnerable, often establishing temporary shelters or relocating groups to less densely populated areas. Observation of infection patterns determined which locations were safer, which groups could interact, and how resources were distributed. Communities learned to coordinate care without facilitating transmission, balancing empathy with prudence. Ethical decision-making became inseparable from practical survival. Psychological endurance was tested like never before. The sudden, high mortality created fear and trauma on an unprecedented scale. Communities relied on ritual, storytelling, and shared responsibility to maintain morale. Elders instructed children not only in survival skills, but in observation and ethical decision-making, who to help, how to forage safely, and how to provide care without succumbing to infection themselves. Mental resilience became a critical instrument for survival, enabling focus, vigilance, and adaptive action. Observation of disease progression remained central. Families monitored the pattern of pustule formation, fever spikes, and the timing of symptom onset, noting which individuals recovered and which succumbed. Survivors became living repositories of knowledge, teaching others how to recognize early signs, manage care, and identify effective herbal treatments. Observation and documentation, even if informal, were essential to the survival of both individuals and the community. Children's roles expanded dramatically in this context. They assisted in daily tasks, monitored water sources, collected edible plants, and helped care for younger siblings or sick elders. These activities were not mere chores, they were practical training in survival. Through participation, children absorbed critical knowledge about hygiene, resource management, and observation-based decision-making. In this way, the continuity of survival strategies was embedded in the next generation. Cooperation between families and clans was essential. Sharing of resources, knowledge, and caregiving responsibilities enabled communities to endure staggering mortality. Observation guided trust. Families who followed protocols, maintained hygiene, and adhered to isolation rules were included in cooperative networks. Ethical behavior was inseparable from survival. Communities that failed to cooperate often experienced higher mortality and greater social breakdown. The introduction of smallpox to the Americas demonstrated how epidemics could disrupt not only individual health but entire social, economic, and cultural systems. Observation, adaptation, and cooperation were no longer simply helpful. They were existential necessities. Communities that observed carefully, adapted practices, and transmitted knowledge managed to survive where others perished. These strategies ensured that even in the face of unprecedented devastation, life persisted, knowledge endured, and cultural memory preserved lessons for future generations. Ultimately, the spread of smallpox across the New World revealed humanity's capacity for observation, adaptation, and resilience in extreme circumstances. Survival was not a matter of luck. It required careful attention to symptoms, rigorous management of resources, strategic isolation, psychological endurance, and cooperative social networks. Indigenous communities, despite immense losses, demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity in responding to an unfamiliar and lethal pathogen. Their survival strategies, observational, ethical, and practical, provide enduring lessons about human resilience in the face of epidemic catastrophe. By the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox had become a constant, looming presence across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. Generations had survived repeated waves, each time observing, experimenting, and refining strategies to endure. The disease was no longer a distant terror. It was an intimate part of daily life, shaping family routines, trade practices, urban planning, and medical experimentation. Survival was increasingly informed by empirical observation, ethical responsibility, and early scientific inquiry. In rural Europe, communities relied heavily on household observation and traditional knowledge. Families monitored fever patterns, pustule development, and recovery timelines, noting which herbal remedies offered relief and which isolation practices slowed transmission. Mothers taught daughters to care for the sick, balance nutrition, and maintain hygiene with simple tools like clean cloths, boiling water, and herbal infusions. Every surviving household became a laboratory, documenting lessons and transmitting them to subsequent generations. Observation, attention to detail, and practical experimentation formed the foundation of survival. Urban centers faced additional challenges. Crowded streets, shared wells, and bustling markets accelerated the spread of smallpox. Municipal authorities began to enforce rudimentary quarantine measures, closing infected districts, isolating travelers, and cleaning public spaces. Observation guided these policies. Streets with stagnant water or high population density were most dangerous, while areas with open ventilation and access to clean water fared better. Citizens were taught to recognize early symptoms, maintain personal hygiene, and adhere to isolation rules. Compliance, trust, and ethical behavior became as vital to survival as any remedy. Medical experimentation began to advance systematically. Healers and physicians observed survivors of mild infections, noting their apparent immunity. In Turkey, Africa, and parts of India, the practice of variolation, deliberate exposure to small amounts of the virus, was refined. Families and medical practitioners observed the outcomes meticulously. Timing, method of introduction, age of the patient, and environmental conditions all influenced survival. Records, often oral or written in notebooks, were used to refine the technique, marking one of the earliest instances of evidence-based intervention. Observation was central not only to treatment but also to prevention. Families monitored which practices reduced transmission, separating sleeping quarters, maintaining clean clothing and bedding, and avoiding contact with infected neighbors. Herbal remedies were applied cautiously, guided by prior observation. Fever-reducing decoctions, poultices to alleviate pustules, and steam treatments were tested and refined based on outcomes. Even minor improvements in these practices could dramatically improve survival odds, illustrating the power of careful observation and incremental learning. Nutrition remained critical. Epidemics often coincided with poor harvests or limited food availability, compounding the effects of illness. Families prioritized nutrient-rich foods for the sick and ensured that water and food were uncontaminated. Observation guided decisions, which grains and legumes retained nutrients during storage, which herbs strengthened the body, and which dietary combinations reduced susceptibility. Communities developed practical rules for sharing scarce resources, balancing immediate survival with long-term health. Psychological resilience was indispensable. The visible symptoms of smallpox, high fever, pustules, scarring instilled fear across generations. Rituals, prayers, and storytelling provided structure and comfort, allowing individuals to endure trauma while maintaining vigilance. Children learned survival skills through observation, play, and small responsibilities. Mental focus enabled better observation, careful application of remedies, and strategic decision-making, reinforcing that psychological endurance was inseparable from physical survival. Children's education was closely tied to survival. They learned to identify medicinal plants, maintain hygiene, manage isolation procedures, and observe symptom progression. Skills were embedded in daily routines, storytelling, and communal activities, ensuring that knowledge of smallpox survival persisted across generations. Observation became both a practical and ethical lesson. Survival depended on attention, accuracy, and adherence to tested methods. Communal cooperation intensified. Families shared resources, coordinated care for the sick, and collectively enforced quarantine. Observation guided trust networks. Diligent and ethical households were included in cooperative efforts, while negligent or reckless families were isolated. Ethical conduct became a survival mechanism, ensuring that even during crisis, communities functioned cohesively and that knowledge, food, and care were effectively distributed. By the end of this period, humanity had begun to develop a systematic understanding of smallpox. Observation, experimentation, and knowledge transmission had transformed survival from mere chance into a coordinated strategy. Early inoculation practices, careful management of food and water, psychological endurance, and ethical cooperation formed a multi-layered defense against the disease. Communities that integrated these approaches survived and passed down lessons that would eventually lead to vaccination and modern epidemic management. The story of smallpox survival in early modern Europe demonstrates humanity's remarkable capacity for observation, learning, and adaptation. Each family, community, and healer contributed to a growing body of knowledge, ensuring that survival was informed by both empirical observation and ethical responsibility. Humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and commitment to knowledge preservation allowed life to endure even in the face of one of history's deadliest pathogens, laying the foundation for future generations to combat disease with science, strategy, and cooperation. The 18th century marked a pivotal turning point in humanity's battle against smallpox, as observation, experimentation, and traditional practices converged with emerging scientific inquiry. For centuries, families and communities had relied on careful monitoring, herbal remedies, isolation, and social cooperation. Now, pioneers began transforming survival strategies into systematic medical approaches that would eventually save millions of lives. Edward Jenner, an English physician, is often credited with the development of vaccination in 1796, but the foundations for his breakthrough were laid by generations of careful observers, healers, and families across multiple continents. In parts of Asia and Africa, traditional variolation had already demonstrated that exposure to mild cases could confer immunity. Communities had observed that survivors rarely succumbed again, documenting these outcomes meticulously through oral traditions and early written records. Jenner's innovation was to combine these empirical observations with controlled experimentation, transforming a centuries-old practice into a scientific methodology. Observation remained central to the early practice of vaccination. Jenner closely monitored the effects of inoculating healthy individuals with material from cowpox lesions, noting that this induced immunity to smallpox without causing severe illness. Each patient became part of a careful study. Symptoms, fever, pustule formation, and long-term immunity were recorded. These observations built on a long history of empirical learning. Ancient families and communities had long noted which exposures conferred protection, which isolation methods prevented spread, and how social behavior influenced outcomes. The power of observation had finally been applied systematically, turning anecdotal knowledge into replicable science. Vaccination quickly became a social as well as medical endeavor. Physicians traveled across towns and villages, teaching families to apply the technique safely and observe outcomes carefully. Communities learned to monitor the vaccinated, noting which individuals developed immunity, which experienced mild reactions, and which required further attention. Observation guided decisions about subsequent exposure, the timing of vaccination campaigns, and the allocation of limited medical resources. Ethical cooperation remained crucial. Families had to agree to participate, observe protocols, and support one another through the process. Despite the promise of vaccination, survival strategies rooted in observation and community cooperation remained essential. Epidemics still occurred, and families relied on centuries of accumulated wisdom. Food and water management continued to play a critical role. Nutritious meals, clean water, and careful rationing strengthened the body's defenses. Herbal remedies, applied judiciously, reduced discomfort and prevented secondary infections. Observation guided these practices, allowing communities to respond dynamically to changing circumstances. Psychological resilience remained a cornerstone of survival. Vaccination was a novel and sometimes feared intervention, requiring trust in practitioners and faith and observation-based evidence. Families relied on storytelling, ritual, and daily routines to sustain morale. Children learned to understand symptoms, observe reactions, and assist in care. Observation was not simply scientific, it was practical, social, and ethical, teaching that careful attention and empathy were inseparable from survival. Global dissemination of vaccination marked a transformative phase. European colonial powers introduced vaccination to parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Observation of local populations guided adaptation. Different climates, cultural practices, and social structures required modifications to the technique and monitoring. Communities that embraced both local knowledge and foreign medical practices improved survival rates, while those that resisted often suffered repeated outbreaks. Survival was thus increasingly linked to the ability to integrate observation-based strategies across cultures. Children and young caregivers continued to serve as conduits of survival knowledge. They assisted with vaccination campaigns, monitored reactions, and learned to recognize early signs of illness. Skills passed down through generations, herbal remedies, hygienic practices, and isolation techniques were reinforced and expanded through systematic medical observation. The continuity of survival knowledge was strengthened, ensuring that communities remained resilient even as disease dynamics evolved. Cooperative networks expanded in scope. Physicians, local healers, families, and community leaders coordinated vaccination schedules, shared observations of efficacy, and disseminated best practices. Ethical conduct, trusting practitioners, adhering to protocols, and supporting one another remained critical. Observation guided these social interactions. Careful attention to who followed instructions and who required additional monitoring was necessary to prevent outbreaks and ensure the effectiveness of vaccination campaigns. By the end of the 18th century, humanity had begun transforming epidemic survival into a form of science. Observation, accumulated knowledge, ethical cooperation, psychological resilience, and empirical experimentation converged to create a robust system of protection against smallpox. Families, communities, and practitioners worked together, blending tradition with innovation to dramatically improve survival odds. Humanity's capacity to observe, adapt, and systematically apply knowledge had reached a turning point, laying the groundwork for modern public health and epidemic management. The journey from early household observation to global vaccination campaigns illustrates the enduring power of careful attention, cooperative action, and ethical responsibility. Each community that documented patterns, experimented with remedies, and shared insights contributed to a collective intelligence that would ultimately overcome one of history's deadliest diseases. Smallpox, once an indiscriminate killer, became a challenge that humanity could confront through observation, strategy, and shared knowledge, a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of survival. The 19th century was a period of dramatic transformation in humanity's struggle against smallpox. Vaccination had spread widely across Europe and parts of Asia, yet the disease remained a persistent threat in regions with limited access to medical care, poor infrastructure, or cultural resistance. Survival now depended on a combination of traditional knowledge, systematic observation, and the expanding reach of scientific practice. Communities that could integrate these approaches increased their chances of enduring smallpox outbreaks, while those isolated from medical networks remained vulnerable. In Europe, public health initiatives became increasingly organized. Governments, municipalities, and local authorities implemented vaccination campaigns, enforced quarantine measures, and monitored outbreaks meticulously. Observation guided policy. Towns that reported early signs of infection could isolate districts, provide care for the sick, and prevent transmission. Health officers maintained detailed records of cases, outcomes, and patterns of immunity, creating an early form of epidemiology. Families were instructed to vaccinate children promptly, monitor reactions, and report any complications, reinforcing the integration of household observation with broader public health strategies. In rural regions, where formal medical infrastructure was limited, survival relied heavily on observation and adaptation. Families continued to monitor symptoms carefully, apply herbal remedies, and manage isolation practices. Community networks allowed for shared resources. Clean water, nutritious food, and caregiving responsibilities were distributed among trusted households. Observation of human behavior guided social organization. Those diligent in hygiene and compliance with quarantine were included in cooperative care, while those who neglected precautions faced exclusion. Ethical responsibility and careful monitoring were essential to survival in these tightly knit communities. Colonial expansion brought smallpox to previously unexposed populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Indigenous communities confronted a disease that had already been mitigated in Europe through vaccination, but for which they had no prior immunity. Survival depended on rapid adaptation, observing symptoms, isolating the sick, and improvising treatments using local herbs and dietary resources. Communities integrated knowledge from foreign medical practitioners with traditional remedies, creating hybrid strategies. Observation became the key tool for navigating the intersection of cultural practices, medical innovation, and epidemic survival. Water and food management continued to be crucial. Epidemics weakened bodies and disrupted normal routines, so families prioritized secure sources of water and nutrient-rich foods. Observation of seasonal patterns, plant availability, and water quality informed survival strategies. Communities established rules for rationing and sharing resources, ensuring that the sick and the healthy both received sustenance. Practical observation became intertwined with ethical decision-making. Survival required attentiveness, judgment, and coordinated action. Psychological resilience was challenged by widespread fear, social disruption, and repeated exposure to death. Rituals, prayers, and storytelling remained critical tools for maintaining morale. Children learned through active participation, helping care for siblings, monitoring water and food safety, and practicing isolation protocols. Observation was central to both survival and education. It enabled accurate assessment of symptoms, careful application of remedies, and strategic coordination of resources. Mental fortitude became inseparable from physical endurance. Observation of vaccination efficacy expanded during this period. Health officials meticulously recorded who developed immunity, who experienced mild reactions, and who required repeat inoculation. Data were shared across towns and regions, creating a growing body of evidence on effective epidemic management. Families learned to observe carefully, track outcomes, and transmit insights to neighbors, strengthening community resilience. Observation transformed survival into a systematic, evidence-based practice. Children continued to play a critical role in knowledge transmission. They were trained in hygiene, early symptom recognition, and care practices, often assisting in vaccination campaigns or helping manage isolated households. These activities embedded survival knowledge deeply into everyday life, ensuring continuity across generations. Observation became a practical, educational, and ethical lesson. Survival depended on attention, vigilance, and cooperative action. Cooperative networks expanded beyond immediate households. Municipal authorities, local healers, families, and volunteers coordinated vaccination, monitored outbreaks, and enforced isolation. Observation guided these networks. Careful attention to compliance, accurate reporting of cases, and monitoring of reactions to inoculation were essential to prevent outbreaks and ensure effective protection. Ethical conduct, trusting practitioners, adhering to protocols, and supporting one another remained as critical as physical resources in sustaining life. By the end of the 19th century, humanity had refined a multi-layered survival system against smallpox. Observation, empirical testing, ethical cooperation, psychological resilience, and systematic vaccination coalesced to create an integrated approach to epidemic management. Communities that mastered these strategies were far more likely to survive outbreaks and transmit knowledge to future generations. Humanity had transformed smallpox survival from an uncertain battle into a managed, scientific endeavor, demonstrating the enduring power of observation, cooperation, and the careful preservation of knowledge. The story of smallpox in the 19th century illustrates the convergence of traditional survival strategies with emerging science. Observation, ethical responsibility, and cooperative action allowed humanity to endure a disease that had plagued civilizations for millennia. By integrating empirical knowledge with systematic vaccination and social coordination, communities were able to preserve life, safeguard cultural memory, and lay the foundation for modern epidemic control. Survival was no longer solely an act of endurance. It had become a disciplined, collective achievement built on centuries of careful observation and adaptive ingenuity. The 20th century represented the culmination of humanity's centuries-long struggle against smallpox. With vaccination widely available, the lessons of observation, cooperation, and empirical learning reached a new scale, transforming survival from a local or national challenge into a global campaign. For the first time in human history, the goal was not merely survival but complete eradication of a disease that had haunted civilizations for millennia. Early in the century, public health systems began to standardize vaccination programs. Observation remained central. Health workers recorded who received vaccinations, monitored reactions, and traced outbreaks. Families and communities were engaged in this process, often assisting with record-keeping and reporting symptoms. The Survival strategies that had evolved over centuries, careful observation of symptoms, isolation of the sick, and ethical cooperation were now integrated into a coordinated, evidence-based public health effort. Communities that adhered to these principles experienced far lower mortality rates, demonstrating the enduring value of traditional survival knowledge. In rural and remote regions, survival continued to depend on both observation and adaptability. Limited access to vaccines and healthcare required families to maintain centuries-old practices alongside modern interventions. Isolation techniques, careful water and food management, herbal remedies, and psychological resilience remained essential. Observation guided decision-making, which households were at highest risk, which local practices interfered with vaccination campaigns, and how resources could be distributed to maximize survival. The combination of traditional knowledge and modern medicine created a hybrid survival strategy uniquely suited to diverse environments. Global collaboration emerged as a critical factor. The World Health Organization (WHO) launched an intensive smallpox eradication campaign in the mid-20th century, relying on meticulous observation, coordinated vaccination, and rapid response to outbreaks. Field teams monitored infection patterns, documented symptoms, and ensured compliance with vaccination schedules. Observation extended beyond individual households to entire nations as data collection and analysis informed strategy, resource allocation, and intervention planning. Survival had become a globally coordinated, data-driven endeavor. Observation of vaccination efficacy continued to improve. Medical teams tracked immunity levels, monitored side effects, and identified populations at highest risk. Families and communities were educated to recognize early symptoms, maintain hygiene, and support vaccination efforts. The meticulous recording of outcomes allowed public health authorities to adjust strategies, target high-risk areas, and improve vaccine coverage. Empirical observation was now formalized on an unprecedented scale, turning survival into a coordinated scientific achievement. Nutrition and clean water remained foundational to survival. Even with vaccination, communities weakened by malnutrition or contaminated water were more susceptible to complications. Observation guided interventions. Health workers noted which regions faced shortages, monitored food and water quality, and coordinated emergency relief when necessary. Communities reinforced practices that had persisted for centuries: safe food preparation, careful water sourcing, and rationing to complement medical interventions. The integration of traditional knowledge and modern science created a resilient, multi-layered approach to survival. Psychological endurance was again critical. The fear of smallpox persisted in some areas, especially where outbreaks were sudden or vaccination campaigns were resisted. Education, storytelling, and community engagement helped alleviate anxiety, ensuring compliance and maintaining morale. Children were trained to participate safely, assisting caregivers, observing vaccination procedures, and learning early warning signs of infection. Observation remained both a practical and educational tool, enabling the next generation to internalize survival strategies. Cooperation expanded beyond households and communities to international networks. Countries shared data, coordinated vaccination strategies, and responded collectively to outbreaks. Observation guided diplomacy, resource allocation, and emergency response, ethical behavior, adherence to medical guidelines, reporting of cases, and support for vulnerable populations became inseparable from survival, demonstrating that coordinated human action could overcome one of history's deadliest diseases. By the late 20th century, these combined efforts culminated in a remarkable achievement: the eradication of smallpox in 1980. For the first time, humanity had eliminated a disease through observation, knowledge transmission, cooperative effort, and scientific innovation. Survival was no longer a matter of chance or local adaptation. It was the result of centuries of cumulative observation, empirical learning, and ethical action. Communities that had relied on traditional survival strategies had contributed to the foundation of modern public health, enabling this unprecedented global victory. The story of smallpox, from ancient epidemics to global eradication, illustrates humanity's extraordinary capacity for observation, adaptation, and cooperation. From households recording symptoms to communities sharing resources and knowledge to international campaigns coordinating vaccination worldwide, survival evolved into a disciplined collective achievement. Humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and commitment to preserving life and knowledge allowed one of history's deadliest pathogens to be conquered, providing a model for combating future epidemics. Ultimately, smallpox's eradication is a testament to the enduring power of observation, ethical cooperation, and intergenerational knowledge transmission. Each step in humanity's long struggle, from early herbal remedies, careful isolation, and community vigilance, to variolation, vaccination, and global campaigns, reflects an unbroken thread of survival strategy. The lessons learned are timeless. Vigilance, adaptability, cooperation, and careful observation remain essential instruments in humanity's ongoing quest to endure and thrive in the face of disease. The eradication of smallpox in 1980 did not mark the end of humanity's engagement with epidemic survival. Rather, it represented a milestone in the ongoing story of observation, adaptation, and resilience. Communities that had endured centuries of outbreaks carried forward a deep reservoir of knowledge, practical, social, and ethical, informing how humanity responds to modern diseases. The legacy of smallpox survival extends far beyond vaccination. It is embedded in cultural memory, public health systems, and collective strategies for enduring adversity. One of the most enduring lessons from smallpox is the power of careful observation. For millennia, families and healers meticulously tracked symptoms, noted patterns of spread, and experimented with remedies. Even in pre-scientific societies, these observations guided practical decisions: who should be isolated, which remedies alleviated discomfort, and which practices reduced mortality. These skills, attention to detail, empirical experimentation, and documentation, remain foundational to modern epidemiology. Public health experts tracing disease outbreaks rely on the same principles, albeit now enhanced by advanced technology. And global data systems, cultural memory, has preserved the knowledge gained from centuries of smallpox outbreaks. Folk tales, songs, and oral histories often describe quarantine practices, herbal remedies, and survival strategies. These narratives carried ethical lessons, emphasizing cooperation, vigilance, and the importance of caring for the vulnerable. Children learned through participation and storytelling, internalizing practical skills and moral frameworks that guided their communities during epidemics. Observation was inseparable from ethical responsibility. Survival depended not only on noticing patterns in disease, but also on acting collectively with compassion and discipline. The smallpox experience also highlighted the intersection of survival with social organization. Communities developed intricate networks to manage outbreaks. Families pooled resources, monitored the sick, and coordinated isolation. Observation guided trust. Households that followed hygienic practices and adhered to quarantine rules were included in cooperative systems, while those who neglected duties were restricted. These social mechanisms were as critical to survival as medical interventions. Humanity learned that enduring epidemics required not only physiological resilience, but ethical, coordinated action across social networks. Modern epidemiology and public health strategies are deeply rooted in these historical practices. Disease tracking, vaccination campaigns, hygiene education, and global coordination all reflect centuries of accumulated observation and experimentation. Lessons learned from smallpox inform responses to contemporary diseases, including influenza, Ebola, and COVID-19. Families, communities, and nations continue to rely on observation, knowledge transmission, and cooperative behavior as fundamental tools for survival, demonstrating the enduring relevance of strategies honed over millennia. Psychological resilience remains a central theme. Historical accounts of smallpox survival illustrate the importance of mental endurance, structured routines, and communal support in coping with fear and loss. Modern public health initiatives incorporate these insights, emphasizing communication, reassurance, and education to reduce panic and ensure compliance with health measures. Children's participation in caregiving and observation during epidemics continues to serve both educational and practical purposes, ensuring the continuity of survival knowledge across generations. Observation extended beyond human health to environmental monitoring. Communities learned to manage water sources, monitor food quality, and select locations for isolation. Observation of seasonal patterns and local ecology informed decisions about movement, food storage, and access to medicinal plants. These lessons, derived from centuries of surviving smallpox and other epidemics, underline humanity's holistic approach to survival. Health, nutrition, environment, and social coordination are intertwined. Global collaboration, another key legacy of smallpox survival, transformed epidemic response. The eradication campaign demonstrated that coordinated observation, data sharing, and cooperative action across nations could overcome even the deadliest disease. Modern international health initiatives continue to draw on these principles, applying them to emerging threats, vaccine distribution, and crisis management. Observation is no longer confined to individual households. It now spans continents, combining local knowledge with scientific research and global monitoring systems. The smallpox experience also reinforced the importance of adaptability. Communities that survived centuries of epidemics continuously refined their practices, integrating new knowledge, adjusting social structures, and embracing innovative interventions like variolation and vaccination. Observation and flexibility allowed humanity to transition from passive endurance to proactive disease management. This adaptability remains critical in contemporary public health, where pathogens evolve and social dynamics shift rapidly. Ultimately, the legacy of smallpox survival is both practical and ethical. It demonstrates that observation, knowledge transmission, cooperative action, psychological resilience, and adaptability are timeless instruments of human endurance. Communities that integrated these lessons not only survived the immediate threat of disease, but also preserved wisdom that would guide future generations. Humanity's ability to confront one of history's deadliest pathogens illustrates the power of vigilance, learning, and ethical action in ensuring survival. The story of smallpox reminds us that survival is not merely the absence of disease, it is the culmination of careful observation, practical knowledge, social cooperation, and intergenerational learning. Each household that tracked symptoms, each healer who tested remedies, and each community that coordinated care contributed to a collective intelligence capable of overcoming a global threat. Smallpox may have been eradicated, but the principles of survival it taught remain vital, guiding humanity in the face of new epidemics, natural disasters, and the unforeseen challenges of a complex world. From ancient households observing fevers and pustules, to indigenous communities improvising remedies in the Americas, to global eradication campaigns in the 20th century, humanity's engagement with smallpox exemplifies the relentless pursuit of survival and knowledge. The earliest records of smallpox reveal a world in which survival was uncertain and dependent on acute observation. Families noticed the subtle, early signs of illness, fever, fatigue, and faint rashes, and improvised methods to isolate the sick and protect the healthy. Herbal remedies were applied experimentally, Water and food sources were carefully managed, and social behaviors were adjusted to minimize risk. Observation was a lifeline, teaching communities how to navigate the unpredictable, invisible threat of disease. Survival was practical, ethical, and communal, relying on attention to detail, vigilance, and cooperation. As epidemics recurred across centuries, communities refined these strategies. Isolation protocols became more structured, nutrition and water management were prioritized, and knowledge of effective remedies was carefully transmitted through stories, songs, and oral traditions. Children learned survival skills as part of daily life, participating in caregiving, monitoring, and resource management. Observation remained central. Those who noticed patterns, documented results, and shared insights improved their chances of survival, embedding critical knowledge within cultural memory. The introduction of variolation marked a critical transformation. Observation of survivors of mild infections guided deliberate exposure to smallpox, reducing mortality and providing immunity. Families and healers tested methods, noted outcomes, and adjusted practices based on observed success. These empirical strategies, though imperfect, represented a major leap forward. Humanity was learning to manipulate the disease proactively rather than merely endure it. Observation, experimentation, and documentation formed the foundation of this emerging survival science. With the development of vaccination by Edward Jenner, survival strategies entered a new era. Communities combined centuries of observation with systematic scientific methods. Early vaccination campaigns relied on careful monitoring of symptoms, immune response, and potential complications. Families and local authorities coordinated efforts, observing outcomes and adapting strategies as needed. Ethical cooperation remained central. Successful survival depended on collective adherence to protocols, accurate reporting, and mutual support. The power of observation was amplified by science, turning traditional knowledge into reproducible, reliable methods of protection. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, survival strategies evolved into large-scale public health systems. Urban centers implemented organized vaccination programs, monitored outbreaks meticulously, and educated the public. Rural communities, often reliant on traditional knowledge, integrated new medical practices with long-standing methods of isolation, nutrition management, and caregiving. Observation remained the cornerstone. Accurate tracking of symptoms, compliance with protocols, and effective use of resources determined whether individuals and communities survived. The global eradication campaign in the mid-20th century exemplified humanity's capacity to coordinate survival on an unprecedented scale. Field teams, national governments, and international organizations collaborated, observing infection patterns, tracking immunity, and rapidly responding to outbreaks. Communities were engaged in the process, learning to recognize symptoms, participate in vaccination campaigns, and assist health workers. Observation, combined with cooperation, ethical adherence, and knowledge transmission, enabled humanity to eliminate a disease that had plagued civilizations for millennia. Psychological resilience, often overlooked, remained essential throughout history. Fear, grief, and trauma accompanied every outbreak. Families relied on structured routines, ritual, and storytelling to sustain morale. Children absorbed lessons through participation, learning observation, caregiving, and ethical decision-making. Mental endurance was inseparable from physical survival. Communities that maintained focus, discipline, and cohesion fared far better than those that succumbed to panic or neglect. The legacy of smallpox extends beyond eradication. The knowledge, accumulated through centuries of observation, experimentation, and cooperation, informs modern public health strategies, epidemic response, and global disease prevention. Cultural memory preserves the ethical lessons of shared responsibility, collective action, and the importance of attentive observation. Humanity's engagement with smallpox demonstrates that survival is not only a physical endeavor but a social, ethical, and intellectual one requiring vigilance, adaptability, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Ultimately, the story of smallpox illustrates a profound truth. Human survival is a cumulative achievement built on observation, cooperation, and ethical responsibility. From ancient households to global health campaigns, each step in the struggle against smallpox represents humanity's capacity to learn, adapt, and act collectively in the face of deadly threats. Survival depended not on luck, but on careful attention, empirical learning, social cohesion, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. As humanity moves into the future, the lessons of smallpox remain vital. Observation, ethical cooperation, psychological resilience, and intergenerational knowledge transmission continue to guide responses to emerging epidemics, climate challenges, and unforeseen disasters. The eradication of smallpox is a testament to what humans can achieve when survival is approached as a disciplined, collective endeavor. Humanity endured, adapted, and ultimately triumphed, leaving a legacy of wisdom and resilience that will continue to safeguard generations to come.